Let's begin with a few questions for our friends over at Mainstream Media Headquarters. Is there any connection between Muslims fighting unbelievers and the Quran's clear command to fight unbelievers?
Of course not! There's no connection whatsoever! It's sheer coincidence!
Well then, is there a connection between, on the one hand, Muslims killing apostates and stoning adulterers, and on the other hand, Muhammad commanding Muslims to kill apostates and stone adulterers?
Impossible! I tell you, it's a total coincidence!
Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl named Aisha, and the Quran declares that Muhammad is the ultimate moral example. Could this be related to the persistent problem of young girls being married off to much older men in the Muslim world?
Don't even think about it, you hate-mongering bigot! Everyone knows Muslims only imitate the aspects of Muhammad's life that are compatible with Western values!
Could there be a link between, say, the persecution of Christians in Egypt, Iraq, and Pakistan, and the Quran's claim that Christians who reject Islam are the worst of creatures, or the Quran's command not to be friends with Christians, or the Quran's command to violently subjugate Christians?
David, you might as well grow a little mustache, because when you say things like this, it only shows you're the next Hitler!
Alright, one more. Is there a connection between Anders Behring Breivik shooting dozens of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian teenagers and Western bloggers criticizing the violent and oppressive teachings of Islam?
Absolutely! There's an indisputable relationship. Bloggers and other Islamophobes, like you, directly cause the attack by manufacturing an atmosphere of racism and intolerance.
Turns out Breivik was taking his orders from the very same right-wingers who are spewing hate here in the United States. Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto included several references to well-known American cranks like Pamela Geller, Frank Gaffney, and David Horowitz.
Are you ready for a story, boys and girls? Once upon a time, there was a peaceful young Norwegian boy named Anders. Anders wanted to get his dad a pocket watch for Father's Day, but he wasn't very good at typing. So, when he tried to type pocket watch into Google, he accidentally typed in jihad watch. Anders suddenly found himself on the website of the fire-breathing, blood-sucking, evil demon vampire dragon monster, Robert Spencer. Anders tried to look away, but the wicked, war-covered, hate-spewing zombie jackal beast Spencer cast a sinister spell, changing Anders from a gentle, kitten-cuddling, smurf-loving bundle of candy-coated tolerance into a fear-mongering, bigoted, fundamentalist Christian sack of terrorism. Fueled by a Nazi-induced what-would-Jesus-do racism, Anders grabbed his guns, jumped into a taxi, and told the driver, "Take me to the nearest mosque." But in the Norwegian language, the word for mosque sounds an awful lot like the word for summer youth camp. Anders ended up on the happy little island of Utoya, but in a fit of Bible-thumping rage, he started shooting everyone he saw, as Islamophobic Western bloggers cheered him on.
Brilliant story! Absolutely brilliant! Someone get this up to Anderson Cooper immediately before Keith Olbermann steals it!
We now know Breivik drew some inspiration from Americans who have written extensively of what they say are the dangers of Islam. The manifesto mentions Pamela Geller, who helped lead the charge against the Park 51 mosque near Ground Zero, describing her as a decent human being and citing her blog Atlas Shrugs 12 times. Another American author, Robert Spencer, was mentioned 46 times. His website, Jihad Watch, was cited an additional 130 times.
Based on what I've been hearing from NBC and CNN and the New York Times, Anders Breivik was radicalized by people like Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, Daniel Pipes, Geert Wilders, and so on. There's only one problem with this story. Those pesky little things called facts keep rearing their annoying little heads. Anders Breivik left us with a 1,500-page manifesto, and in this manifesto he explains in vivid detail exactly how he was radicalized. As we're about to see, none of the people being blasted by the media had anything to do with Breivik's extremism. The great irony here is that while the media have been holding Spencer and Geller accountable for Breivik's attack, according to the manifesto, we should be blaming the media. Yes, you heard me correctly. If you want to blame someone other than Breivik for his violent radicalization, you have to blame the media. You can't miss this if you read the manifesto. Perhaps that's why the media are so busy pointing their diabolical little fingers at everyone else. There were 3 major steps in the radicalization of Anders Breivik, and we know when all 3 of these steps occurred. Step number 1. Breivik sees an immigration problem. Breivik grew up in Oslo, one of the centers of Muslim immigration. He says that he witnessed firsthand dozens of instances of Muslim gangs physically attacking helpless young Norwegians. He writes, "I know that there are hundreds, even thousands of incidents per year. I have personally witnessed around 50 incidents where ethnic Norwegian youths ranging 14 to 18 are harassed, beaten, raped, and robbed, and it's getting worse every year." One of Breivik's best friends when he was young was a Muslim named Arslan. Breivik says, "At the time I couldn't understand why he loathed Norway and my culture so much. He simply despised it, and I was unable to truly comprehend why at the time. I remember during the first Gulf War, he used to cheer loudly whenever a Scud missile was launched against the Americans." As they got older, Arslan began hanging out with the Pakistani community more and more, and according to Breivik, he eventually started attacking and even raping Norwegians. Breivik says he spent years observing things like this, ultimately concluding that Muslim immigration was destroying his city. Oslo used to be a peaceful city. Thanks to the Norwegian cultural Marxist multiculturalist regime, they have transformed my beloved city into a broken city, a bunkered society, a multiculturalist crap hole where no one is safe anymore, to use blunt language. Now, you might not believe everything Breivik says. Pretty much everyone doubts at least some of his claims. But there's no question, at some point during his teenage years, he came to see immigration as a massive problem. That was step 1.
As his long manifesto shows, the suspect in these killings seemed to be heavily influenced by some people in this country who write and blog about the perceived threat from Islam.
Step number 2. Breivik studies Islam. When Breivik initially became concerned about Muslim immigration, he was still convinced that Islam is a religion of peace because that's what he'd been taught in school. He writes, "At that time I knew very little about Islam. The official view on Islam, portrayed by our academic institutions, teaches us that Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion. I had no knowledge about the concepts of jihad, dhimmitude, jizya, ummah, taqiyya, Quranic abrogation, Wahhabism, Salafism, and Saudi Arabia's role in spreading the latter." But his views changed when he studied Islam during his late teens and early 20s. "I identified myself during this time as a cultural conservative, economical liberalist from age 16 to 21. During this time, I studied all the major ideologies in depth, everything from Marxism, socialism, Islam, fascism, nationalism, capitalism, etc." Breivik says in the manifesto that he read both the Quran and the Hadith. Based on his study of the Muslim sources in the late 1990s, he came to believe that the problem wasn't simply immigration, it was Islam. That was step 2.
The right-wing websites, they provide a greenhouse for extremist ideas.
Step number 3. Breivik decides that a peaceful solution is impossible. Lots of people agree with Breivik that immigration is hurting European countries in various ways, and many people agree that Islamic teachings are contributing to the difficulties. But the vast majority of people in the West believe in dealing with issues peacefully and democratically. When Robert Spencer sees that a group is being persecuted in the Muslim world, he draws attention to it on his blog. When Pamela Geller sees that a Muslim developer is totally disregarding the feelings of the 9/11 families, she holds a rally. When I see something that bothers me, I make a YouTube video. The people who are involved in the counter-jihad movement are usually people who are repulsed by violence. They're horrified when the innocent suffer. They abhor terrorism. That's why they can't ignore the Quran's command to violently subjugate non-Muslims. It's also why they don't call for violence against Muslims or anyone else. But Breivik is different. He advocates bloodshed and cruelty. So if this guy reads the writings of people like Spencer and Geller, who condemn violence, where did he get the idea that slaughtering people is the way forward? Well, he tells us. In the 1990s, when Breivik became convinced that Islam is a threat to European civilization, he decided to go into politics. But he soon realized that anyone who questions Islam is labeled a racist and marginalized. Since Islam was beyond criticism, Breivik came to regard political participation as utterly pointless. It is meaningless to participate in the democratical process when you are not allowed to raise important issues without being subjected to political and social persecution through stigmatization and ridicule. It is time to acknowledge that we, the cultural conservatives of Western Europe, are deceiving ourselves to believe that it is remotely possible to change the system democratically. Breivik realized this in the year 2000. Around the same time, he also concluded that the media has such a stranglehold on public perception, speaking out against Islam is futile. There is no freedom of speech in Europe. If you don't cheer and embrace your own annihilation, you are a racist bigot, an enemy of the establishment, and must be suppressed, ridiculed, undermined, and persecuted. Well now, you're a young Norwegian who sees immigration and Islam as the chief threats to Western society, but all peaceful avenues of addressing these threats have been blocked by politicians and the media. What do? In order to successfully penetrate the cultural, Marxist, multiculturalist media censorship, we are forced to employ significantly more brutal and breathtaking operations which will result in casualties. In order for the attack to gain an influential effect, assassinations and the use of weapons of mass destruction must be embraced. The primary goal of the shock attacks is not the immediate physical manifestation of the attack, destroying a few buildings, killing a few hundred traitors, but rather the indirect effects. Shock attacks will have the potency to penetrate the strict censorship regime of the cultural Marxists, multiculturalists. The purpose of the violence is to break through the protective wall the media has constructed around the topic of Islam. Breivik wanted to do something so heinous that even the combined forces of the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, ABC News, and the New York Times could not silence his message. He justifies the move from no peaceful means available to violence is necessary by quoting Robert Spencer. Oh, did I say Robert Spencer? I meant John F. Kennedy, who famously declared, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Interestingly, Breivik claims that Muslim terrorists are the ones who showed us how to break through the media's stronghold. Unfortunately, spectacular operations like these are the only way to be heard. Everything else we have tried has failed and yielded nothing. The Muslims showed us that deadly shock attacks are the only tool we have at the moment which will guarantee that our voice is heard.
Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller and Walid Shoebat, all of these people were cited repeatedly in the Norway Terrorist Manifesto. And I think it's clear that these individuals provide the intellectual and rhetorical underpinnings for the kind of extremist views that lead to the attacks we saw in Norway.
So here we have a full outline of Breivik's rise to violent extremism. Who's responsible? Well, since there's no ideology out there that promotes the killing of Norwegian teenagers as a way of making a point, this seems to be a Breivik original, and I would therefore be inclined to hold Breivik responsible. However, since everyone really wants to play the blame game here, let's think about who or what played a role in Breivik's thinking along the way. In the early 90s, Breivik concluded, based on personal experiences with Muslim immigrants, that immigration is a problem for Norway. Who's responsible for that conclusion? You can either blame the Muslim immigrants, or you can say the immigrants did nothing wrong, Breivik's just a nut. Take your pick, but the only people we know of who were involved in Breivik's thinking during step one were Breivik and the immigrants. In the late 90s, Breivik studied the Muslim sources and realized that Islam is a dangerous ideology and that Sharia is antithetical to Western society. Who's responsible for that realization? Well, you can blame the Muslim sources, or you can say, there's nothing wrong with the Muslim sources, Breivik's just a nut. So take your pick, Muhammad's teachings or Breivik's mind. Finally, Breivik decided that due to the suppression of thought and speech by politicians and the media, peaceful means of dealing with Islam are useless. Now, who's responsible for Breivik thinking that if you criticize Islam, you'll just be labeled as a racist, Islamophobic, hate-mongering bigot? Where did he get that idea? He learned that from the people who sit around all day calling anyone who disagrees with Islam a racist, Islamophobic, hate-mongering bigot. Yes, I'm talking about our ethically challenged friends over at mainstream media headquarters.
So, you're saying that by creating an atmosphere where people feel it's pointless to address their concerns through dialogue, we're actually causing people like Breivik to turn to violence and bloodshed in order to make their points.
I'm not saying it's silly. Breivik did.
Well, I think I've learned something today. I've learned that you're a Nazi!
How original. Now, the media have accused Western critics of Islam of radicalizing Anders Breivik. But we've gone through the steps of Breivik's radicalization. Where do Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller and Daniel Pipes and Geert Wilders and other critics of Islam fit in? They don't. Breivik says he was already planning an attack in 1999 when NATO bombed the Serbs, and by 2000 he had abandoned all hope of a peaceful solution. Why are the dates important? Well, Spencer started blogging in 2003. Geller started Atlas Shrugs in 2004. Breivik had been planning a violent attack for years before I'd heard of any of these people. So unless our media friends would like us to believe that Spencer and Geller have a time machine powered by 1.21 gigawatts of Islamophobia, I'd suggest they come up with a theory that at least partially corresponds to reality. It's true, of course, that after planning a violent attack for several years, Breivik put together his manifesto, and that in this manifesto he cites all kinds of books and websites to support certain points, and he does cite Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, along with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, John F. Kennedy, Winston Churchill, George Orwell, Rudyard Kipling, Lao Tzu, Friedrich Nietzsche, John Stuart Mill, William James, Aldous Huxley, Mark Twain, Muhammad, a bunch of Muslim scholars, and many others. There's no way Breivik became violent by reading Spencer or Geller. He was already violent, and if he'd paid a little more attention to Spencer and Geller, he might have changed his plans because they still have confidence in the ability of speech and writing to change hearts and minds. Instead, Breivik let the media and politicians shape the options available to him, leaving us with a double tragedy. The first tragedy occurred when Breivik used dozens of teenagers as tools for his agenda. The second is still occurring, because the media and politicians are now using the same victims for their agenda.
Looky here, bigot! The mainstream media understands that the only way to end the slaughter of Norwegian children is to end all criticism of Islam. You're a Nazi for watching this video to the end.